I have little flyers here. The University Writing Program has a number of cool events coming up. We've worked with Botanic Gardens to get every DU student, faculty member, and staff member in free on Monday, May 12th for an open mic night. DU students are invited to perform their own work alongside community members throughout Denver. And then we have our second annual Poetry Slam coming up on Monday, May 19th. So if you're interested in any of these events, come grab a flyer from me. My email's probably on there. I'm David Daniels. I teach in the University Writing Program, and you can get more information from me about those. We have 2 more faculty lectures in conjunction with RIT 1133. The dates are here. Next Monday is a quantitative panel. We have faculty members from political science and engineering who will talk to you about quantitative research reports. And then Wednesday, May 14th, the last of our series, again on qualitative research. We have anthropology and marketing represented by faculty. Tonight is qualitative research. And we have a number of different faculty from different disciplines talking to you today about the research and writing that they do. And we'll follow that up with a brief question-answer period. Qualitative research asks us to close our books and to leave our museums, to temporarily, put away our novel about a fictional drag queen or our short story about a fictional Vietnam vet, and to spend time looking at actual drag queens and at actual Vietnam vets. Through observations, case studies, and in-depth interviews, by getting involved with the community, qualitative researchers turn our attention away from representations of people and onto the actual people, in the places where they live or work, to the rituals that they perform, both privately and publicly, to the ceremonies that they hold dear. In part, this interest in actual people within their actual surroundings stems from an understanding that textual representations of people and of their histories are almost always distorted by the author's hand, whether that hand hold a paintbrush or a pen. And also from the belief that such distortions can carry with them the erroneous myths and stereotypes, the flawed reduction of human experience in all of its messy breadth and depth to a certain type, what we refer to in literary studies as the bad guy, or the angel whore, or the token minority, or that one gay guy in that one movie back then, you remember him? Or even, perhaps better for our purposes here, that type of student who can't use a comma to save her life. Now, quantitatively, through standardized tests and numerical data, a lot has been argued about that student who can't use a comma to save her life. Legislation has been passed because of her. Funds have been withheld from school systems because of her. Because she, whoever she may be, who can't use a comma to save her life, has come to represent in the minds of legislators and political pundits an entire mass of hims and hers. But by spending a little time with her, and I say this as someone who's dedicated the past 10 years of his career to spending time with her, we learn that she is actually pretty brilliant and sad, and that she's trying really hard, and she's full of new ideas, and full of a very human kind of terror and sometimes joy. And that her comma usage on paper is okay, not very good or standardized, but that this means very little in comparison to how she learns and what she offers and how she responds to knowledge and how she holds herself quietly as she absorbs what her colleagues tell her, and how she goes about generating new ideas of her own, bad comma or not. These attributes, the more nuanced and the less verifiable, can only be gotten at through direct participation. They can't be easily measured. Qualitative research hopes to restore the value of the particular, often in response to quantitative data, by taking the generalizable truth and testing it against the actual. Tonight we have 3 scholars from different disciplines to discuss their uses and understanding of qualitative research. Our first is Professor Christina Krebs, a professor of anthropology and museum studies. Professor Krebs' research, teaching, and applied work crosses a number of disciplines and concerns, including anthropology, museology, art, international cultural policy, and development. She's been studying the museum as a cultural phenomenon and cross-cultural approaches to museums, curation, and heritage preservation for a number of years. There's a specific number of years here, but just for a number of years. And recently, she has, there's a quantitative number of years here, but qualitatively, a lot of years. She has begun examining recently the role of museums in promoting and protecting intangible cultural heritage. And I will add that her visit to my 1133 students last year are what prompted what's been a really successful lecture series. So I'm proud to introduce her. Please welcome Professor Krebs.
So I have to really project right through my mic. We have props. I'm just going to put them out here. First of all, how many of you know what anthropology is or have taken an anthropology course? Only a few. So I bet I probably should start by explaining what anthropology is, right? The field is basically one of those fields that really crosses many disciplines. We consider ourselves situated in the social sciences, in the humanities, and in the hard sciences because we study all aspects of human beings from the very beginning in terms of the fossil record of human evolution. The people who study that are called paleontologists and are very much scientists. They get into the genetics of human existence, and now DNA studies and genomes are very important in all of that. And let me just put this up on the board. So in the United States, we have what's called this giant chart, 4-field approach. And so it's still pretty common in universities. And when I was going to graduate school, pretty much everybody getting a PhD in anthropology had to study or at least be familiar with each of these fields. So I had to take classes in biological or physical anthropology, in which we study genetics, paleontology, the human fossil record, bones and teeth, as people like to say, then archaeology. Most people who know anything about anthropology know about archaeology. And if you say you're an anthropologist, most people immediately assume you're an archaeologist. And everybody has seen Indiana Jones, right? So the popular representation of archaeologists going off and being swashbucklers and getting into all kinds of adventures. Archaeology is the study or reconstruction of the past through the archaeological record, meaning artifacts, things that people made and left behind so that we can try to reconstruct and try to get an understanding of how people lived in the past and how cultures have developed through time. I have this weird dyslexic thing when I write on a board, sometimes I misspell, so let me know. And then linguistics, because language is so critical to understanding human cultures. um, origins of languages, spread of languages around the world. By tracking the spread of certain words or parts of words, we can actually track how people have moved around the planet over time. And then cultural anthropology. Some people say sociocultural. Which is, I'm a cultural anthropologist, meaning I study contemporary cultures and aspects of those cultures. And most anthropologists are cultural anthropologists in the United States today. We dominate the field. And so I will be talking a little bit about what I have done and in terms of doing cultural anthropology. It's like, David, your introduction to qualitative research, I thought was extremely eloquent. That was a very good synopsis of some of the things that qualitative researchers do. The fundamental or hallmark of the anthropological method used by cultural anthropologists is fieldwork. Anthropologists started to do fieldwork in the 1920s, 1930s, and before that, the home of anthropologists, for the most part, was the museum. The museum was the laboratory for anthropologists who were studying cultures through artifacts, through objects. It was believed that that was one way to see and learn something about people's technology, the way they use the resources in their immediate natural environment, and their arts, and that sort of thing. But then there was a big shift in anthropology, where objects became of less importance, and key figures in the history of anthropology said, well, you know, you really can't study or learn about people secondhand through objects or through the text that explorers, early missionaries, and people that went off around the world, Westerners, Europeans who went around the world and coming in contact with and having encounters with other cultures. They were writing about people, but there was, you know, question about the authenticity of those texts. And this is, you know, the anthropology was very much a product of Western expansion and colonialism, and developing in Europe along with other fields like sociology and economics and politics at the end of the 19th century. So in the 1930s, this famous anthropologist named Malinowski said, you really, in order to truly get to know another people and their way of life or their culture, you have to go live with them. You have to, I mean, how brilliant is that? I mean, it's one of those scientific breakthroughs, right? That it was only through first-hand observation that you could really get to the heart of people's lives, the way they think, the way they act, the way they behave toward one another. And so anthropologists started studying things like social structure and organization, kinship systems, all these things that, topics that were seen as critical to making up a culture. So, first-hand observation, and it's still the fundamental methodology of cultural anthropology. And if you haven't done at least minimum, absolute minimum, and even at that, you're kind of looked down on if you've only done like 6 months of field work. Because how much can you really learn in 6 months? So minimum a year. And before you do that, what do you have to do? If you're going off to another country and living with people, you first have to learn the language. So it's a huge investment. Anthropologists, the average time it takes an anthropologist to get a PhD is about 10 years because of all this preparation before you even go to the field. It probably would help if I'd be less abstract and just talk about myself. I did my field work for my dissertation in Indonesia. I should have brought a map, PowerPoint map. I guess you can just look it up on your computers since a lot of you are on the internet right now. You can just look up Indonesia and see where that is. It's in Southeast Asia, in between mainland Southeast Asia and Australia. And I did my field work on the island of Borneo. And that makes me kind of an old-time anthropologist, or sort of a cliche anthropologist, in that anthropologists are sort of, National Geographic image of the anthropologist going off to exotic and foreign places, like the jungles of Borneo. So some of us still do that, but most people today are studying in their backyards. They're studying issues related to public health. A lot of applied anthropologists today are working on HIV/AIDS issues, all kinds of public health issues, social issues, poverty, homelessness, this sort of thing. Because it's become more and more difficult to conduct research in other countries. I brought this as another prop. These are the research permits that I had to get from the various departments of the Indonesian government in order to do research. It took a year to apply for the initial research permit, and then after I got to Indonesia, I had to stay in Jakarta, the capital, and wait another 3 months for all of these to get the appropriate stamp on them. So most people just don't want to deal with that anymore, most anthropologists, but also because countries today have put more and more restrictions on letting foreigners in, and well, what anthropologists do is basically snoop around and and hang out with a purpose. So it's more and more difficult to do this kind of work, so a lot of people are opting to stay at home and also to get funding. It takes a lot of money to do field work. I was very fortunate and had funding through the Fulbright program. I don't know if any of you have heard about that, but it's a U.S. government international scholarly exchange program. So a lot of preparation, and I studied Indonesian, the language, about a year and a half before I went, and I did an extensive language study program in Hawaii. I was lucky that it was in Honolulu. So that's a lot of work, and not that many people are willing to go through that kind of preparation anymore. But it's absolutely necessary because you can't go off and start to do research someplace if you don't speak the language. And the difficulty in a place like Indonesia is that there are about 360 different ethnic groups that all have their own languages. And in the area that I worked in, the central Borneo, there are about 10 different ethnic groups with their own languages. So I didn't want to have to I didn't feel it was necessary to learn the local language because I was studying a government institution, and most of the people that worked there, it was a museum in the middle of Borneo, that the government decided all provinces in the country should have a museum. So that's what I was studying, how that happens. How do they use this, do they interpret this Western museum concept in a local cultural context? So I just used Indonesian because all of the people that worked there who were civil servants spoke Indonesian, the national language. If people had gone to school, that's what they knew. But if I was to really spend a lot of time in villages, I spent some time in villages. I needed to know Naju, the local language. That would have been another 2 years of learning another language. So I just decided to stop with Indonesian. So David mentioned that unlike in English and literature, you said, that you're making representations of people. Well, anthropologists are making representations of people too, in their what we call ethnographic writing. And when we're doing field work, we're doing what's called in anthropology ethnography, which has become a method that's used by a lot of social science researchers today. Again, it's based on the premise that you need to go and talk to people, to hang out with them, to conduct interviews, to conduct community surveys, to get that first-hand knowledge and experience. And so that's basically the crux of the ethnographic method. And then we take all of this data that we collect in our field notes. And I have some examples of field notes. And imagine this about this high, which I didn't want to lug all of these notebooks here today, which would have been approximately 18 months of field notes that we take every day. You go back to your house or wherever you're out observing whatever you're observing. In my case, it was people working at the museum and all the activities and things taking place. And you go home at night and you start writing up your notes. And in addition to, most anthropologists have both field notes and journals. So it's a lot of writing, and you're trying to remember everything that happened throughout the day. Sometimes we use tape recorders, and now today, video cameras and all of the technology that people use today for recording. But 20 years, almost 91, 92 is when I was doing my field work. It was mostly just, writing by hand. I did have a little typewriter. Remember, we're in places that don't always have electricity, running water. I washed my clothes by hand for 2 years in a little tub. And we did have electricity for about 8 hours of the day. So you really are using an old, whoops, this one's blank. Just, writing by hand. This one is just, like a journal. And it's actually pretty, it's a lot more reliable than in computers, because I had friends, and I still go back and do field work in Indonesia, and I take an old computer because it's extremely humid, and insects love to get inside of computers. So you may have this fancy Mac that you take to the field, but then you turn it on one day and ants are running, or you don't turn it on because it doesn't work anymore because ants are living in it. So pen and paper, the old reliable method. So we turn all these field notebooks of months and months of observations, and I was also very computer illiterate when I returned from field work in '93. And there were programs, there was software at that time for processing data, but I was afraid, or I just didn't want to do it. So I used this other extremely high-tech method of index cards. And so what I did was go through and laboriously, I made categories, or what some researchers call domains, different topics that I was interested in. For example, in the museum, collections, exhibitions, administration, local knowledge about these objects, or local knowledge about how people took care of these objects in a traditional way outside of the museum. I have one card on reflexivity. Have you talked about reflexivity?
Not in this context.
Not in this context.
I don't know.
You don't know.
Not in an Indonesian context.
Okay. I know I'm kind of jumping around because I'm not following notes, but back to this notion of representation. And I said that when we write up our field notes and turn them into text, even though we've had this firsthand experience with people, we make them, anthropologists, into representations of a culture. That one individual person may become a stand-in for the whole group. And so there's a generalization process that happens. That's this more conventional, that's one of the conventions of ethnographic writing that's been called into question in more recent years as anthropologists have turned their gaze on themselves and started thinking critically about ethnographic research and writing. And one of the outcomes of this is a new, not new now, it's 20 some years old, that kind of critical self-reflection and self-consciousness about what we're doing, who's benefiting, whose interests are being served, how does my position as a North American white woman influence the way I see people in Indonesia and their way of life, that we're constantly thinking about in this mode of positionality. What's my position and how does that influence my research? All of this has become very important in qualitative research. Quantitative researchers are very much into objectivity, which you've talked about, objectivity and subjectivity. And we try to be, cultural anthropologists try to be objective as much as possible. We don't make things up. We're not supposed to make things up. We're not novelists, we're not journalists, that we try to follow the scientific method to a certain degree, but we can't because we can't, I always say, when you're studying culture, you can't step in the river twice. Meaning, culture's always changing. If I go back to my original field sites, I can never have the same experience that I had in 1992 on August 1st. It's not going to be the same. So we cannot repeat experiments like people in the hard sciences do. So we're somewhat subjective, and there's interpretation involved. And in fact, when I was in graduate school, this was one of the big theoretical paradigms of anthropology, interpretive anthropology. Clifford Geertz was sort of the pioneer, and he was very much influenced by literary theory. And so there was this kind of in the 70s, 80s, and even into the 90s, what we call a literary turn, where anthropologists start thinking about writing and representation and narratives and all these things that usually people in English and literature think and talk about. So in being reflexive, I was going through my field notes and looking at examples when I have here intervention, when maybe I was intervening, and if we have times, I can tell some funny stories about when I would intervene in the very thing that I was supposed to be studying, and that was problematic, right? Because I was supposed to just be observing. Other topics, education in the museum, tourism. Tourism was very important. Every once in a while, a German backpacker would come through. Very hardy tourists, because this was not a tourist mecca. It was not Bali. It was a pretty nasty location, actually, kind of a swampy, malarial-ridden, godforsaken place, actually, that not many tourists ventured there. So every once in a while, and I would talk to them about why they came and all that. So it's museum culture, because for me, I was studying the culture of a museum in a non-Western cultural context. So I was interested in how that all played out. Dance, music, government policy, so on and so forth. So all of these notebooks and all of these field notes and all of these journal entries got reduced to a little card, and I would have an index system that I created with the date, that I had all of my notebooks numbered, so I'd have the number of the notebook, the page in the notebook, and so on and so forth. So, of course, now, again, there's software for all of this. But anyway, and then we take this, and this, what I'm trying to show you is the process of how do we go from collecting data in the field, that all of these are data, contain data, and that we have to translate. It's a translation process, translation and interpretation. As you know, in all translation and interpretation, you include some things and you leave out other things. So it's not entirely objective. It's very subjective. What we choose, it's a selective process. And so this is part of the critique of anthropology, or specifically ethnography, having a pretense of being a science. There are some anthropologists who will firmly stick to the idea that we are science, we're doing science. I'm over here in the humanities soft field that say it's really all about interpretation. And if we're upfront about our position, where we're coming from, what we're looking for, what we're not trying to cover in a particular work, then okay, we're trying to be honest about what we're doing and clear to our audience, but it's still an interpretation. That doesn't mean that we're complete relativists and that anything goes and that everybody's interpretations are equal. No, just like some novels are better than other novels, some interpretations are stronger than other interpretations, or more, I hate to even use this word because it's the scientific method, valid. But we try to be. So from here, oh, I forgot the dissertation, the critical middle point. Imagine a big, fat opus right here in the middle. That was the dissertation. They granted me a PhD on the basis of that work. Okay, you got your spurs, you did it, you're out of here, go get a job. Good luck. And then from the dissertation, you're supposed to, if you're a scholar and an academic, turn that dissertation into something that people might want to read, because people outside of your committee members really don't want to read a dissertation. So, where is the book? The book, here it is. So dissertations become journal articles. I brought this one. I didn't realize this room would be so cavernous. I was going to pass this around because it's a kind of funny picture of me with all these people in Borneo singing that along. I guess we could pass it around. This is the anthropologist in the field, in a journal called Practicing Anthropology, which is a more applied work. So we turn, this is like one of my first articles on, in this, I was later the editor of this journal, not when I published in it, but yeah, that's kind of not really a good idea. But it was based on my field work in Indonesia, and what has become sort of my specialization, my contribution, I like to think, is what I call indigenous curation, or thinking about how other cultures have their own, other meaning non-Western, have their own ways of collecting, caring for, interpreting, and valuing things. Because there's this whole ideological bias in the Western museum world that the museum is a modern Western cultural product, and that other cultures don't have a preservation ethos. They don't care about keeping things. They just let their stuff rot away and nobody's taking care of it. And this argument has been used to justify collecting, and some would say hoarding, objects from other cultures and keeping them in our museums based on the idea that, well, Western museology or museum work is scientific, we have the best methods, we know best how to care for these things. Well, I discovered in my field work in Borneo that people didn't really get this whole museum idea, that the government created this building and they brought in experts like me and people from the Netherlands and Australia and specialists from the capital city to create these exhibits that, funny, they looked just like the exhibits in the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. Have any of you been to the anthropology halls in the Denver Museum of Nature and Science and seen the dioramas of native cultures? No one? One person has been. But have you been to the Smithsonian or the American Museum of Natural History? You know what a diorama is? It's kind of a reconstruction, a realistic reconstruction of some aspect of people's culture. Well, they had created in this museum dioramas of like a fishing village. So they would have a house, a life-size house with canoes and fishing nets and all this stuff, and people were like, I don't get it, you know? It's like, why is the government doing this? I mean, that's like the house that I live in. That's the canoe that I use every day to go fishing. This makes no sense. Of course it made no sense because the museum was located in a place where the culture was still very much alive and being lived. So that was one of the contradictions that I was documenting on when you take an institution from one cultural context and basically reproduce it in another without thinking about whether or not it fits or it works. And so as a result of looking at how people would react and respond, and then how the museum would bring in ritual specialists to help them make exhibits, I realized, wow, the ritual specialists are really the curators. They're the people who had the knowledge about how to take care of certain things, and the museum staff was reluctant to make exhibits about certain topics that had to do with religion because that was the domain of the ritual specialists. The staff members didn't have the right to that knowledge and the right to touch those things and work with those things. So I was looking at how this Western museum culture was sort of butting up against the local indigenous ways of taking care of things that were of value and meaning to them. So this is all part of the critique of ourselves, the critique of anthropology and museums and museum work and the study of other cultures and representation. So then these articles, journals and everything, eventually you have the book, which as an anthropologist, you're supposed to write books. So this book, which came out in 2003, it's called Liberating Culture, as David said, and the subtitle, because we always have these subtitle, Cross-Cultural Perspectives on Museums, Curation, and Heritage Preservation. So what I'm arguing in this book is that we have to liberate culture from anthropologists, museum people who have been saying, we know what's best for everybody else, and we're going to come here and show you how to make a museum show you how to take care of your culture. And in the process of doing that, we've undermined or disappeared local traditions. So we're not preserving culture at all. We're doing exactly the opposite. So this is a critique of Eurocentric museology and the management regimes of that Eurocentric museology. So this is just an illustration of the ethnographic research and writing process, which is really representing culture, cultural representation. And I don't know if you've got in anthropology, part of the reflexive move and critique and what we call the post-colonial critique has been very much about looking at these conventions and how they need to be changed so that people that we study, we're no longer the voice of those people. With the politics of cultural representation, there's a lot of discussion about who has the right to represent whom. I no longer have the right, when I'm doing an exhibit or working with students, I don't have the curatorial authority or ethnographic authority to say, this is how this culture is, from my experience in research and writing. Today, we're trying to be much more inclusive and get multiple perspectives and multiple voices, that the people themselves just might have something to say about their cultures. So in the museum world today, we're doing a lot of co-curation and collaboration with communities in representing their culture, that the Western scientists no longer have the last and final word. So I don't know how long I'm supposed to wrap it up.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, stop there.
Yeah, thank you, Kristen. Thank you, Professor Krabs. Our next speaker has been a valued friend of the writing program. He's helped us out in a number of ways. Some of us specifically have designed courses with his help. This is Eric Fretz. He's the director for the Center for Community Engagement and Service Learning. Eric's primary responsibilities include working with faculty to develop innovative service learning classes, teaching service learning classes, and working with center staff to develop mutually beneficial community partnerships. Previously, Professor Fretz directed the Community Studies Center at Naropa University in Boulder, Colorado, served as a visiting assistant professor at Michigan State University, received tenure actually in the English department at Lawrence College. So this will be an interesting perspective. I was talking to Eric a couple days ago of someone who moved away from English studies or purely interpretive, more in the direction of community engagement and service learning. So please welcome Eric Fretz.
I feel like the third guest on the Late Show. You know, they bring out Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie first, and then the guy that does the stupid pet tricks. That's me tonight. David, you made qualitative research sound sexy when you and I just thought, wow, I want to do that. That was great. And then Christina, your experience and your understanding of your discipline, your field is really, truly admirable. So it's tough to follow you guys, but I really appreciate the invitation. Thank you. And I guess the takeaway, I'm going to give you the takeaway right away and then unpack by simply telling you my story. I'm not really going to do much more than that, and I don't have any props. But the takeaway from me to you is this, that take seriously these opportunities to do qualitative research because you never know when you're going to need them. And I think I'm saying that because as somebody whose career trajectory and writing life has, as David said, changed considerably over the course of the 15 years or so that I've had an academic career. in the last 5 years or so, I've really come to realize that I missed out on something when I didn't take seriously the opportunities to do qualitative research when I was an undergraduate. In a lot of ways, you all and I share the same skills in terms of doing qualitative research, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. But let me just back up a little bit, and I'll just tell you about the kind of trajectory of my writing. I'm going to stick to my writing life as much as I can. Oh no, I wanted to ask you one question. Who's taken a service learning class here, or a community engagement class? Can you really raise your hands just so I can see it? Or who knows, like, oh yeah, if you use that term, service learning or community engagement, you know what I'm talking about. Oh, 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, hi. I know you all. Yeah. Oh, so not even a quarter. Not even. That means the rest of you have no idea what I do here, which means I'll talk about that in a little bit. But let me back up. I got my PhD in English and American Studies in 1995. So that means from 1990 until 1995, I was studying to be an English studies scholar or a literary scholar. Now, what that meant in my writing life was, I mean, it's so different than what you were talking about, you know, Christina. Because what it meant was I'd go to class, and then I'd go home to my little apartment in East Lansing, Michigan. I'm from Michigan State. And then I'd read, and then I'd go over to my computer and I'd write, and then I'd go to sleep. And then I'd wake up the next day, and then I wouldn't have class. So I'd pick up a book, and I'd read. And then I'd go to my computer and I'd write. And then maybe I'd walk around the block or go have lunch or something. And then I'd come back and I'd read. And then I'd write. And that was my life for 5 years. It probably sounds really boring, but it was really fun, actually. I mean, it was really intellectually generative, but like I didn't care about other, like human beings were not a part of my world. It was the text and the computer, and you know, it was the classic example of living in your head. So what did I write about? Oh, I wrote about postmodern theory. I published on F. Scott Fitzgerald. I was really promiscuous in my writing. I think that's probably why I didn't continue being an English professor. I wrote about F. Scott Fitzgerald. I wrote about P.T. Barnum. I'll tell you about that in a second. I wrote a lot about Hawthorne, M.M. Bakhtin, who was a literary theorist, just all over the map. There was no portfolio there. There was just I wrote about what I was interested in. And that was fun. One connection is my dissertation included Geertz to a great degree. So that's one thing we have in common. And would it help if I won't bore you with the dissertation, but it was actually kind of fun. I never talk about it anymore, and I guess this is an opportunity to do that. But so I had a bunch of notes like you did, but they weren't notes from real people or from real experience. It was just, you know, I'd take notes and I'd think and then write. But what I did was, as I was reading and thinking through in my classes, I saw this really interesting trend happening in American literature and American culture from the Revolutionary period up till about 1850. And the way I defined it was, in the Revolutionary period, there was this idea of selfhood, and what I mean by that is like how you presented yourself in a public sphere. And the idea was that you presented yourself in a very transparent way. Like you presented yourself as who you were. You were authentic, you were real. And the greatest example of that, do you know Paul Revere? Do you know what do you know? I see you shaking your head. What do you know about, like what do you do? Sorry? Yeah, right, yeah. He did that. And you know anything else about Paul? He let us know when the British were coming. The British are coming, you learned that. Anybody else know what he did? He worked with metals. He made things, pictures, and decorative arts. And that was his craft. He was really a craftsman. He just happened to be in the militia, you know, he worked during the day, and then he was in the militia at night, and they said, hey, tell everybody the British are coming, and he did his job. And that's how he got famous. But he was a wonderful craftsman, actually. And there's this John Singleton Copley, who was a great artist in the Revolutionary period, did a portrait of Revere. And in this portrait, you see Revere sitting at a table like this. He's actually sitting down. And he's holding one of his works, and it's like a stainless steel thing. It's not stainless steel. I don't know what it was made of, copper or something. Sorry? Well, it was pewter, yeah. It was finely polished, right? I might be going on too long about this, but sorry, I can't resist. And finely polished, and he's sitting on at this table that's highly polished too. And what you get is this reflection of Revere's, and he doesn't have his wig on either, which was a big thing. He probably didn't wear his wig when he was riding the horse either. So you see Revere's reflection in the pewter and on the table. And I just use this as a kind of microcosmic example in the Revolutionary period. It was honored to present oneself in a transparent and reflective way. Like, fast forward 60 years without giving you all the messy details, and then P.T. Barnum comes on the scene. Do you know P.T. Barnum? What do you know about him? Circus, there's a sucker born every minute, right? This guy wrote over 10 editions of his own autobiography. He just kept writing it over and over and over again, and when he'd go to the circus, he'd hand it out. In fact, that was when you bought a ticket. He was a museum guy too. Great museum in New York. Right, but crazy stuff. Like, he'd cut a fish in half and he'd sew it to a monkey, and then he'd put it in a, you know this, right? Then he'd put it in a case and he'd pass it off as you know, this fantastic animal that he went to Borneo to get. I don't think it was in Borneo, but to get. So there's some interesting connections here. So 60 years after Revere, here's P.T. Barnum running around New York City in America, and his presentation of himself was entirely inauthentic. And he becomes basically a millionaire. So I was just looking at what happened, and how that happened in 60 years, that becomes okay. Blah, blah, blah. So that was my writing for a long time. That's what I did. That's what I taught. Right? And then what happened? And this is what fundamentally changed my writing life, and this is the appeal to you, to really take seriously the qualitative work, okay? So what happened was, I just got sick and tired of doing that, and I couldn't do it the rest of my life. No offense against English professors. I still love them. They're still some of my best friends. I just couldn't do it. And so I taught a service learning class, just because I thought it would be fun to do. And I got really interested in it, because it gave me an opportunity to we went into the schools, we went into the public schools, and we just did some basic mentoring stuff, and I connected that back to 19th century American lit that I was teaching. So I connected that back to the kind of cultural revolution that Ralph Waldo Emerson and Walt Whitman were trying to articulate in the mid-19th century. I had a blast. It was really fun. My students, my undergraduate students, began to understand, I thought anyway, Whitman and Thoreau and Emerson in new ways, and were able to interpret that to different audiences. And I said, oh, this is what I'm going to do. This is it. You know, I'm not being a professor. So I started doing more service learning work, and eventually now I find myself here at DU, where my responsibilities are to help faculty, like all the great people at the writing program, and Christina and all of her colleagues, to develop courses where they're able to connect their academic work, their rigorous, interesting, comprehensive academic work to communities and to publics. Well, what that did was it just shattered my writing life. It didn't shatter it. I mean, it actually opened it up in a lot of ways. But it made, I had to write in an entirely different way. So a couple things happened. One, I couldn't write just for academic audiences. You know, I had to write for very broad audiences, because I had to prove both to my academic colleagues and peers, and to funders, and to students, and to people outside of the academy, that this was a worthy pedagogy and a worthy way of doing work in the academy and the university. And one of the things I needed to do that was qualitative research. So I cheated. What I did was, and I'll tell you about just 3 writing projects I just finished up this year. I'll do it really quickly because I don't have time to. So what I did was, the cheating part was, I just found people who could do it really well, and I partnered with them. You know what I mean? So I'll give you an example. Our center manages a public good fund. It's dollars that come from the provost office, and our job is to give those dollars to faculty at DU who are doing public good research, and to help them, to support them to do their community-based work and community-based research. Well, after I was here for about a year, I realized we got to find out what's working here. You know, what are the impacts of these dollars that we're giving out on faculty? Well, come on, I've been writing about P.T. Barnum for 10 years. There's no connection. I needed the qualitative ability to get this work done, because we had to do focus groups. I had to talk to people. So then now I'm back in Christina's shoes, except I'm not in an exotic place. I'm here in Denver, trying to figure out, is this thing working? Is this fund working? How are we impacting people's lives? How can we make it better? So all those questions that you asked earlier were the questions that I found myself having asked, but I had no skills. So I called 3 of my colleagues. I need 3 people to That's how bad I was, or deficient. So I called Nick Cutforth in the College of Education, who's nationally recognized for his work on community-based research, and I called Sheila Summers Thompson, who was our assistant provost for institutional research and assessment. You want somebody like her on your team. And then I called Nicole Nicotera, who's an assistant professor in the Graduate School of Social Work, who's just a phenomenal qualitative researcher. That's how I learned how to do this. We spent hours together developing the focus group questions, which I don't know if you guys are doing that. Are you developing focus group questions and things like that? Yeah, so I had never done that before, and here I am, over 40, learning this new thing, right? We developed focus group questions. We tested them. We brought people together. I learned how to use a tape recorder. You know? I learned how to do transcriptions on it. Thank God I didn't have to do any of them. Somebody else did them for us. And then I learned how to, what was really cool though, is I learned how to interpret that data in the same way I interpreted the texts that I was reading when I was a graduate student and a professor. There was no difference really. In fact, my interpretive skills that I learned as an English professor and as an English student really helped me in terms of interpreting the data. But it was, and this is another takeaway, it was getting the data, you know? Digging it up, collecting it, talking to people, that was the challenge for me, and doing it right and proper was the challenge. I could kind of want to talk about my projects, but I think it's 7:30 and I know what you want to discuss, so I'll just cut it off there. How about that? And then maybe that'll come up in the questions. Yeah, thank you.
Good. And moving along, because I do want to leave some time for Q&A. Our last speaker is one of my colleagues, Rebecca Schultz-Colby, from the University Writing Program. Professor Schultz-Colby's research interests include writing assessment, as well as the intersections between rhetoric, composition theory and pedagogy, and new media. Yes, she is one of the people teaching a class on World of Warcraft right now. She's published on the role of blogs in graduate education and the use of computer games to teach first-year writing. She's currently co-editing a special issue of Computers and Composition Online, examining how computer games can better enhance writing instruction. Please welcome Rebecca Schultz-Colby.
Thank you, David. So, I'm from composition. I got my degree in basically writing and writing instruction. So what I study is basically how do you teach writing? How do you make writing instruction better? And so for my dissertation, really, I was interested in studying the classroom and how you teach. So one of the problems that I have as a teacher, of course, is when students don't come to class, if they don't turn their work in, they don't turn it in on time, or they don't turn it in at all, because of course that makes my job all the more harder. I can't help students if they don't come to class. I can't help them if they don't have a draft. I don't know what they've written. I don't know anything. I can't do my job. So this is a huge problem. So this is what I decided to write my dissertation on. Why do students do this? This is my research question. And I went, I didn't create a hypothesis. I didn't know what I was going to discover. So I decided to observe somebody else's class, not my own class, because of course, as a teacher, I have too much power over that grade, and so as students will tell me what they want to hear, just so they can get an A. I didn't want that relationship, so I wanted to really hear what students had to say as a neutral observer, someone who wasn't going to influence them, and they had no stake in lying to me or telling me a story, or they could be honest. And so I observed a class. It was summer school, 8 weeks, and I observed every single day. I took extensive notes. I also wanted to interview students, interview why they were having these problems. What's going on in their mind? What's going on? But I also wanted to interview the instructor and see what his take was. So to do this, I had to, of course, get consent from all the students in the class. And it was very nerve-wracking because if one student said no, I couldn't do the project. I also had to get consent for students to be interviewed. And luckily, 6 students consented. presented. And of course, only 3, came through at the end. I was going to interview, I wanted to interview them 3 times. Of course, this is summer school, it's hectic. And this is out of their way, it's not part of their grade, it's not part of anything. I didn't pay them. So, they came to, there was an interview in the beginning, an interview in midterms, and an interview at the end. And so I had 3, and that was actually really good. But because I did that, I got a very good in-depth view of this class and these students. Of course, when I was done, I had, just like Christina was explaining, I had, 120 notes of observation notes alone. Plus, I also tape recorded the class. I also tape recorded the interviews. And so when I transcribed all of this, I had, over 100 pages of just interviews. So how was I going to, make something written? What was I going to do with all this data? Make it, coherent. So make it have a point. So what I did was I coded the data. I really was trying to look at themes, recurring themes that came up, looking specifically at why students don't turn in work, looking at why they don't come to class, and seeing what recurrent themes came up, phrases, words, ideas, and from there I really did discover some really interesting things. One of my interviewees, he gave himself the name of Chosen, was a first-time African-American student. And none of his family had ever gone to college, and his mother had scrimped and saved her entire life just so that he could go to college. So of course, this put an incredible amount of pressure on him. And he would just freeze and not turn in his work because he was like, oh, it's terrible, I can't do it, it's horrible. And so he was already a perfectionist, and it's just confounded all his fears. And in fact, in our interview, he actually didn't turn in, he wasn't going to turn in his final paper, and I actually intervened. I wasn't the passive, interviewer at that point, because I knew if he didn't turn in his final paper, he was going to fail. So I basically, I said, you're going to fail. If you don't turn it in, that's for sure. If you turn it in, maybe it's not that A perfect paper, but you at least have a fighting chance. So he turned it in, but that was where I thought ethically as a teacher that was my duty. So, and it did pass the class. And then Angelina, and she also gave herself this name. That's not her real name, but her thing was she, in a classroom like this, in a big lecture hall, she just completely kind of disengaged. She couldn't ask questions, she couldn't talk, she was really funny, loved to make jokes, and just felt really comfortable in a classroom where she could talk, and it was no big deal, and she could make jokes, and ask questions if she felt lost. Ask questions if she didn't get the material. If she didn't feel like she could talk to the professor at all or ask questions, then she would just, it's hopeless, I can't get it. There's no way, so I'm just not going to go to class. So then she would stop coming to class, and of course, that's a vicious cycle. So then she would do really poorly. So it was really interesting, these in-depth views. And of course, again, I'm an English major, and as well. So also to interpret the data, I was very overt about how I also interpret the data, but I used Michel Foucault, who's a philosopher, and he's a very interesting philosophy on power. As a teacher, I do not have absolute power in the classroom. And Michel Foucault's theory on power is that no one can own power. You don't own power. Power is a relationship between people. And this is very true in the classroom. If I fail a student, this does not make me all powerful. It does not make me a powerful teacher. If you think of, me being a powerful teacher means that you learn the material well. And that you not only learn the material, but you excelled beyond that. That makes you a powerful teacher. So, of course, when you're not coming to class and not doing the work, then, my power as a teacher, yeah, I could give you an F, but that doesn't make me powerful. So there's, again, I was looking at power as it's a negotiation, it's a conversation. So when you don't come to class, you're actually creating a conversation with your instructor. It's not a good conversation because there's a whole lot of interpretation that's going on. The instructor doesn't have any clue why you're not coming to class. But you know, it does create a sort of dialogue open to very erroneous interpretation. So a better dialogue is one where the student actually does talk to the teacher, does open up and talks about their problems. And so in some way, there can be a negotiation in which both parties are powerful, in which the student does learn effectively, in fact, learns more than what they're supposed to learn, and the teacher can teach. And that's really what I learned in my dissertation. Chosen finally did tell the instructor the incredible amount of pressure he was under, how he was supposed to help out with his family, he was supposed to help his mom run her business, and he didn't have a lot of time, plus all the other psychological pressure he had. And so this instructor really did help him through this, and so he did eventually meet the deadlines, meet the goals of the class, and pass. So, and in that way, I got a really in-depth view of students, and I can't really use my findings and say, okay, all students are like Chosen. No, this is a very in-depth view of one particular student. So really, generalizability, all I could say was really teachers need to spend the time to get to know their students and open that dialogue between students as much as they can. And really, that's all I could say in that general way. But it was a good way of getting to know students very specifically. So, and I learned things I would not have learned if I'd done any other type of research. So, that's what I have to say.
Great. Okay, we actually did pretty well. Let's devote a few minutes, if we can, to question and answer. The three of you want to stand up here. I don't know that there will be a Q&A, but I hope there are some questions, especially for those of you writing case studies or ethnographies in your classes right now. These are the people to ask. Nothing? Are you debating, asking? No?
This room makes us.
I know. Lars.
How did you study change when you taught math?
Well, that's a good question. I do try to make more of an effort to, if there's a problem, to conference with students, to talk to students one-on-one, to ask them questions. And also, I am willing, if there are real problems, to negotiate, but with that intention that, yes, they are going to meet the goals of the class, but to help them along the way. So.
Are you going to switch classes? Yeah.
What about questions about the research process? When I was a fresh person, I didn't have a clue about what professors did and how research became usable material, or it was very mystified. It was very mysterious that somehow they wrote books and they did all this stuff and produced all this stuff, but I didn't know how that was done. I mean, the whole research process of collecting data and the different ways you can collect data and the different ways you can use data. Do you have a clear understanding about that? Now the hands.
Rebecca?
You were talking about how you had so much information and you could only include a certain part in your final report. How do you decide what information to include?
You have certain questions that you've addressed in your research, and so you're taking the information or the data that supports or disproves some of the questions that you were trying to get to answer as in your research. We start out with research questions. Sometimes in the hard sciences, it's a hypothesis that you're trying to prove or disprove. For me, it's more a question of how. Those questions of how does something come about? What is the process? More interested in process rather than making discoveries or like in the hard sciences. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and what about if you come across information outside of your original hypothesis? How do you incorporate that into
That's extremely important if it has bearing on your question, because it may make you completely change your original idea. I mean, I have an example of when I went to the field with certain questions that I had based on as much as I could know about my field site. I'd actually gone to that area the year before, a reconnaissance trip to Indonesia to choose a field site, a place where I was going to spend a lot of time. And I chose that field site on the basis of what the people in the Ministry of Culture in Jakarta said, oh, this place, this museum would be a good place for your study because it's a brand new museum where people have in a community, in an area where people have no idea what the museum is about. And in fact, people are not yet, and they use this word, belum, not yet museum-minded, but they use that word museum-minded in English. So it's like, oh my God, what does that mean? What does it mean to be museum-minded? How do you make, because their job was to make people museum-minded. That became the title of my dissertation, Becoming Museum-Minded. So I went there to study that and chose that field site on the basis of that question and on the basis of that data that I'd been given that was a brand new place. Well, after I was there for a few months, I started to discover reports and things from like 1973. And the first time I went there was 1989. I went back in 1991 for research. And then I found out that it wasn't a brand new museum at all, that it had actually been started in the early 70s by local community members. But that whole history had been erased by the officials in the central government in Jakarta because it didn't fit into the story of the central government being responsible for creating these museums in all the provinces. You didn't want the local people, a bottom-up initiative, to be recognized when the government was it was an authoritarian dictatorship that it was there. So that was an example of how that changed everything.
And one thing I would add to that, we're sympathetic there. I mean, Christina and Eric and Rebecca had a long time to observe, take notes, and so forth. In 1133, at least Rebecca and Ian and others, my class, you're observing for a couple weeks, okay? All I can suggest to you is it's a negotiation between observing with a critical eye for something while still staying open-minded enough so that if something more critically interesting happens in the periphery, you capture that.
Right.
But we understand you're spending a couple weeks at your field rather than months and months and months.
But
so you're
you
not
can
going to be able to
still-
flesh this out.
Yeah,
but the
you can still
methodology
get a
is
lot.
the same.
And you can still get a lot of information in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
A lot.
You had a question?
I was basically going to ask her like how she came about formulating the questions.
Okay.
There was some other questions
Anything
on the
else?
research. Because we've done different kinds of projects, but at the same time used very similar methods, and I did a lot of interviewing that I had to transcribe from Indonesian into English, but the same, listening to the recorder and so forth. So same methods, very different topics in very different settings. Is that a question? Or are you twirling your pencil?
Did your university arbitrarily assign you to do research in Indonesia, or
No.
did you had an interest in Indonesia first and then go to research?
I ended up in Indonesia. I won't go into the long, laborious story, But as a result of doing research for my master's thesis in the Netherlands, and Indonesia was a Dutch colony. So I had done research on Dutch museums and colonialism, and that's how I ended up in Indonesia, the other side of the colonial story, in studying museums in a post-colonial context. We didn't at all talk about ethics or whatever.
Yeah, we'll have to get that in our classes. I mean, one thing we'll certainly talk about in my classes, and all three of you especially could comment on, but we're running out of time, is the ethics behind qualitative research. Whether it's Rebecca reporting on actual things her students are doing, and you heard kind of in the name change, the names they gave themselves, but then the cultural politics that Christina focused on, and certainly what Eric organizes with these service learning courses. I know there's a balance between having students go to, say, a homeless shelter or a domestic violence women's shelter, and what this means to take a person from a position of privilege and power, not to get too Foucauldian, and negotiate with that space. I mean, real ethical dilemmas and questions come up. We'll have to cover that in our own classes, I think.
And the whole issue of like IRB is Institutional Research Board.
Which I might get sued by today, so we will bring that up too. And thank you all for coming out.